The wind screamed like a wild animal outside the small dirt house. Margaret pressed her babies closer to her chest, feeling their tiny bodies shiver against hers. The fire in the corner had died down to just glowing coals, and she had no more wood to burn. 3 days ago, her world had fallen apart. Thomas, her husband of 2 years, had been burning with fever for a week. She had done everything she could think of: cold cloths on his forehead, spoonfuls of water, prayers whispered through sleepless nights. But nothing worked. The fever took him anyway, leaving her alone with twin babies who were barely a week old. The other families living nearby had packed up and left that same morning. They were scared. The sickness might spread, they said. They couldn't risk their own children getting sick. Margaret had watched from her doorway as wagon after wagon rolled away toward town, 20 miles south. Not one person stopped to ask if she needed help now. She sat in the growing darkness, listening to the storm get worse outside. This wasn't just any winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard that killed people. Snow was piling up against the windows. Cold air leaked through every crack in the walls. The babies cried almost all the time now. They were hungry, but Margaret's milk was drying up. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days. There was only a small bag of flour left in the kitchen, and she had already mixed the last of it with water to make a thin soup that barely filled her stomach. Margaret tried to remember what her mother had told her about surviving hard times. "Keep the babies warm," she whispered to herself. "Keep them fed, keep them safe." But how could she do any of those things when she had nothing left to give? She looked around the tiny house that Thomas had built with his own hands. They had been so proud of it when they first arrived in Kansas territory. It wasn't much, just one room with dirt walls and a grass roof, but it was theirs. They were going to build a better life here, raise their children on their own land, maybe even start a small farm. All those dreams seemed foolish now. The land was beautiful in summer, with endless grass waving in the breeze and wildflowers everywhere. But winter here was brutal. The wind never stopped blowing, and when storms came, they came with a fury that could bury a house in snow. Margaret stood up carefully, holding both babies in her arms. She walked to the window and used her sleeve to wipe away the frost. Outside, she could see nothing but white. Snow was falling so thick she couldn't see past the fence that surrounded their small yard. The wind was bending the fence posts nearly to the ground. She had tried to signal for help yesterday. When the storm first started, she had hung Thomas's red shirt outside and lit a lantern in the window. She thought maybe someone traveling the main road might see it and stop. But no one came. The shirt was probably buried in snow by now, and she had to save oil for the lantern. The babies started crying again.
Oh.
Margaret sat back down near the dying fire and tried to calm them. "Little ones," she whispered, "Mama's here. We'll be okay." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. She tried to think of what Thomas would do if he were here. He was always good at solving problems, always found a way to make things work. When their first cow died, he traded work with a neighbor to get another one. When the roof leaked during spring rains, he climbed up there with mud and grass until it was fixed. But Thomas wasn't here anymore, and Margaret felt lost without him. The storm outside was getting louder. It sounded like a freight train passing. Right over their house? Margaret had heard stories about blizzards like this one. They could last for days, burying everything under mountains of snow. People got trapped in their houses and ran out of food. Some froze to death when their fires went out. She looked at her pile of firewood, just 3 small pieces left. Might last until morning if she was careful. After that, she would have to start burning furniture. The wooden table Thomas had made, maybe some of the shelves. It would buy her a little more time, but not much. Margaret tried to remember how far it was to the nearest neighbor who might have stayed for winter. The Johnson family lived about 5 miles east, but she had seen their wagon leaving too. There was old Pete, who lived by the creek, but he was probably in town by now. Everyone with any sense had gone to town to wait out the worst of winter. Babies were getting weaker. She could feel it in the way they moved, and how their crying was getting softer. They needed milk, real food, warmth. They needed things she couldn't give them. Margaret had always been strong. Growing up in Missouri, she had helped her father work their farm. She could milk cows, tend chickens, and work in the fields all day without complaining. When she married Thomas, and they decided to try their luck in Kansas, she wasn't afraid of hard work or simple living. But this was different. This wasn't about working hard or making do with less. This was about surviving when everything went wrong at once. This was about keeping her children alive when she barely had enough strength left to keep herself going. She tried to make plans in her head. If the storm stopped tomorrow, maybe she could try to walk to town. But 20 miles through deep snow, with 2 babies, in her condition, she knew it was impossible. Even if she could somehow carry both babies that far, they would all freeze long before they reached help. Maybe she could wait until the storm passed and then try to signal someone from the road. But what if no one came this way for weeks? What if the next travelers didn't arrive until spring? As the night grew colder, Margaret made a difficult decision. She gathered every piece of cloth in the house, blankets, towels, even some of Thomas's old shirts. She wrapped the babies as warmly as she could, layer after layer, till they looked like little bundles. Then she lay down with them, close to the last bit of warmth from the fire. She pulled more blankets over all of them and tried to share what little body heat she had left. The babies had stopped crying. She wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the storm. She thought about Thomas and how much he would have loved these babies. She thought about her parents back in Missouri, who didn't even know their daughter was fighting for her life in a Kansas blizzard. She thought about all the plans and dreams that seemed so far away now, but mostly she prayed. She prayed for the storm to end. She prayed for someone, anyone, to find them. She prayed for her babies to be strong enough to make it through one more night. And as the wind howled and the house creaked around them, Margaret held her children close and waited for whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning sun barely showed through the thick gray clouds when Ayanna stopped his horse and studied the ground. The elk he had been tracking for 2 days was wounded and moving slowly. Blood drops in the snow told him the animal was getting weaker. It would be good meat for his family, enough to last several weeks, if he could find it before other hunters or wolves got there first. But the storm that had been building all night was getting worse. Ayanna looked at the dark sky and felt the wind picking up. He had lived on these plains his whole life, 32 winters, and he knew when a blizzard was coming that could kill a man caught in the open. The elk would have to wait. He turned his horse toward a group of hills where he knew there were caves that could provide shelter. That's when he saw it, a thin line of gray smoke rising in the distance. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. But what kind of people would be out here in weather like this? Ayanna had mixed feelings about the settlers who had been moving into this territory. Some were decent folks just trying to make a living, but others had caused trouble for his people. There had been conflicts, misunderstandings, and sometimes violence on both sides. Most of the time, it was better for everyone if they just stayed away from each other. But smoke in a storm usually meant someone was in trouble. And Ayanna's father had taught him that a person's character was measured by how they treated others when no one was watching. Help comes back to you when you need it most, his father used to say. The smoke was coming from what looked like a settler's house built into a hillside. As Ayanna got closer, he could see it was one of those dirt houses the settlers liked to build. Cheap and quick, but not very strong. This one looked like it was barely holding together in the wind. What worried him was how quiet everything seemed. During storms like this, settlers usually made noise, chopping wood, calling to their animals, moving around inside their houses. Doubt! But this place was silent except for the wind. Even the smoke from the chimney was very thin, like the fire inside was almost dead. Ayanna tied his horse to a fence post and walked toward the house. Snow had piled up against the door so high that he had to dig with his hands to get it open. When he finally got the door free and pushed it open, the scene inside made him stop breathing for a moment. A woman was lying on the floor near a pile of cold ashes that used to be a fire. She was so still that at first he thought she was dead. But then he heard something that made his heart race, the weak crying of babies. 2 tiny voices, so soft he almost missed them under the sound of the wind. The woman had 2 small bundles pressed against her chest. Even unconscious, she was holding them tight, trying to keep them warm with what little heat her body had left. Ayana knelt down beside her and gently touched her forehead. She was ice cold, but still breathing barely. The babies were alive, but in bad shape. They were too quiet, too still. Ayana had helped deliver babies in his village and knew what healthy newborns should look like. These 2 were clearly starving and half frozen. Without help soon, all 3 of them would be dead before the storm ended. Ayana looked around the small house and could see what had happened here. There was a man's clothing folded neatly on a shelf, but no man anywhere. The woman was wearing black clothes, the color settlers wore when someone died. There was almost no food left, just an empty flour sack and some dried beans scattered on the floor. This woman had been left alone with newborn babies in the middle of winter. No neighbors, no family, no help. The thought made Ayana angry. In his village, this would never happen. When someone died, the whole community took care of the family left behind. Children were never allowed to go hungry, and mothers were never left to struggle alone. But being angry wouldn't save these people. Ayana worked quickly to get a fire started again. He broke up some of the furniture and used his flint to get flames going. The house began to warm up slowly, and he could hear the babies crying a little louder, which was actually a good sign. He melted snow in a pot and got some water down the woman's throat. She coughed and opened her eyes for a moment, looking confused and scared. When she saw him, she tried to move away, clutching the babies tighter. "Easy," Ayana said in English, which he had learned from traders. "I help you safe." The woman stared at him with wide eyes. She had probably never been this close to a Comanche before. Many settlers had heard scary stories about his people, most of them not true. But she was too weak to fight or run, and maybe she could see in his face that he meant no harm. Ayana knew he had to make a decision fast. The storm outside was getting worse, and this tiny house wouldn't protect them much longer. The walls were already cracking from the wind, and snow was blowing in through gaps. Even with a fire, they might not survive another night here. His village was about 12 miles away, but he knew the way even in a blizzard. They had warm lodges, food, and women who could nurse the babies. His people also had medicine and knowledge about helping sick mothers get their strength back, but bringing white settlers to his village could cause problems. Some of the younger warriors were already angry about settlers taking land and hunting grounds. Others remembered raids and broken promises from years past. Would they accept strangers, especially white strangers, even ones who were dying? Ayana thought about his own wife, who had died 2 winters ago trying to have their first child. He remembered holding her hand as she slipped away, remembered the emptiness that followed. The sound of these crying babies brought back all those feelings, the hope, the loss, the wondering what might have been. He couldn't save his own wife and child, but maybe he could save these 3 lives. Maybe that would mean something. Ayana made his choice. He gathered every blanket and piece of cloth he could find in the house. He wrapped the woman and babies together, making sure they could breathe, but keeping them as warm as possible. Then, he picked up the whole bundle, surprised by how light the woman was. She was much thinner than she should be. Getting them to his horse was the hardest part. Wind was so strong he could barely stand up, and snow was falling so thick he could hardly see. But his horse was well trained and stood still, while he figured out how to secure his passengers. The ride to his village took 6 hours that felt like 6 days. Ayana had to stop several times to check on the woman and babies, to make sure they were still breathing. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words he couldn't understand. The babies cried when they had strength, but mostly they just held on. When the familiar shapes of his village finally appeared through the snow, Ayana felt relief wash over him, but he also felt nervous. How would his people react to what he had done? Would they understand why he couldn't just leave these strangers to die? As he rode into the village, people came out of their warm lodges to see what was happening. Some looked curious, others looked concerned. A few looked angry. Ayana knew that in the next few minutes he would have to convince his people to save the lives of 3 strangers who belonged to a group that had caused them so much trouble. But as he looked down at the tiny faces of the babies, still fighting to stay alive after everything they had been through, he knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes doing what was right mattered more than doing what was easy. The village chief walked out of his lodge slowly, his weathered face serious as he looked at what Ayana had brought home. Behind him, other tribal members gathered in a circle, their voices low but filled with concern. Some were shaking their heads, others pointing at the bundle in Ayana's arms. "You bring white woman here?" the chief asked in their native language. His voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. In these times, when soldiers look for reasons to attack us, Jana slid down from his horse carefully, still holding Margaret and the babies. "She was dying, grandfather. The babies too. I couldn't leave them." An older woman named Winona pushed through the crowd. She had gray hair braided with beads and wore a thick buffalo robe against the cold. Her face was lined with years of wisdom, and she was known throughout the tribe as their best healer. She had delivered most of the babies in the village and saved many lives with her knowledge of plants and medicines. "Let me see," Winona said, reaching for the bundle. When she pulled back the blankets and saw Margaret's pale face and the tiny babies, her expression softened. "Bring them to my lodge, now." Some of the younger warriors stepped forward, blocking Ayana's path. "This is not wise," one of them said. "White settlers bring trouble. They take our land, kill our buffalo, make promises they don't keep. Why? Should we help them?" Ayana understood their anger. He had seen the changes happening to their way of life as more settlers moved into the territory. Hunting grounds that had fed their people for generations were being fenced off. Sacred places were being claimed by strangers who didn't understand their importance. There had been fights, and people on both sides had died, but as he looked down at the babies in his arms, barely clinging to life, politics didn't matter. "These are not soldiers or land grabbers," he said quietly. "This is a mother with newborn children. They've done nothing to hurt us." The chief studied Ayana for a long moment. He had known this young man since he was a boy, had watched him grow into one of their finest hunters. Ayana was not reckless or foolish. If he said these people deserved help, there was probably a good reason. "The storm is getting worse," the chief finally said. "We will talk about this later. For now, they need warmth." Winona's lodge was one of the largest in the village. Thick buffalo hide walls and a fire pit in the center that kept the space warm, even in the worst weather. She had Ayana place Margaret on a bed of soft furs near the fire, and immediately began checking on all 3 of them. Margaret was unconscious again, breathing shallow and her skin cold to the touch. The babies were crying weakly, their tiny voices barely audible. Winona had seen this before, people who had been without food and warmth for too long, whose bodies were shutting down to save energy. "Bring me hot water," she told the women who had followed them into the lodge, "and send for Ayasha and Kiona. Their babies are still nursing. These little ones need milk right away." While the women worked, Winona began treating Margaret with remedies that had been passed down through generations. She made a tea from dried roots and berries that would help restore strength. She warmed oils by the fire and gently massaged Margaret's hands and feet to get her blood moving again. She spoke in soothing tones, both to Margaret and to the babies. Even though they couldn't understand her words, the 2 nursing mothers arrived quickly. Despite the storm still raging outside, Ayosha was a young woman whose own son was only a few months old. Kiona was older, with 3 children of her own. Both women took one look at the tiny babies and didn't hesitate to help. "They're so small," Ayasha whispered as she held one of the twins, "and so hungry." It took patience and gentleness, but eventually both babies began to nurse. The women took turns, making sure each baby got enough milk. Slowly the crying stopped, and the babies began to look more alert. Margaret woke up several hours later, confused and frightened. The last thing she remembered was lying in her cold house, holding her babies and listening to the storm. Now she was in a warm place that smelled of wood smoke and herbs, surrounded by people she had never seen before. When she saw Ayana sitting nearby, the memories came flooding back. A Comanche warrior had found her and brought her somewhere safe. But where? And why? She had heard so many stories about what happened to white people who were taken by Indians. Most of the stories were probably not true, but fear made her heart race anyway. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ayanna spoke slowly in English, choosing his words carefully. "You safe. My people help you. Your babies drink. Milk now. They get strong." Margaret tried to sit up, looking around frantically for her children. Winona gently helped her lean against some rolled-up furs and pointed to where the two women were holding the babies. Both twins were sleeping peacefully, their little stomachs full for the first time in days. "They're alive," Margaret breathed, tears running down her cheeks. "They're really alive." Over the next few days, as the storm continued to rage outside, Margaret slowly began to recover. Nona fed her small amounts of soup made from buffalo meat and wild vegetables. She gave her teas that helped her body start producing milk again. Most importantly, she showed her kindness that Margaret had never expected to find. The village women took turns caring for the babies, making sure they were always warm and fed. They cooed over the twins, remarking on their red hair and pale skin. Some of the children were curious about Margaret, peeking into the lodge to stare at her with wide eyes before running away giggling. But not everyone in the village was happy about the situation. Margaret could hear heated discussions outside the lodge, voices raised in argument. She didn't understand the language, but she could tell that some people were angry about her presence. Ayanna explained the problem to her one evening as they sat by the fire. "Some of my people think you bring trouble. They remember bad things that happened with white settlers. They worry that soldiers will come looking for you." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What happens if they decide I can't stay?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but I think Winona has a plan. She speaks for you to the council. She tells them you are not like other settlers. You are just mother who needs help." The council meeting happened on the 5th day after Margaret's arrival. She wasn't allowed to attend, but she could hear the discussion from inside Winona's lodge. Voices rose and fell, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. The debate went on for hours. Finally, Winona returned to the lodge with news. "You can stay. Until you are strong enough to travel," she told Margaret through Ayanna's translation. "But when spring comes, you must decide where you want to go." Margaret nodded, understanding that this was more generosity than she had any right to expect. These people had saved her life and the lives of her babies, even though they had good reasons to mistrust her. The least she could do was respect their decision and try to learn their ways while she was here. As the days passed, Margaret began to pick up some of the Comanche language. She learned to say thank you and please in the names of simple things. She watched how the women cared for their children and tried to copy their techniques. She helped with small tasks around the lodge, wanting to contribute something in return for all the kindness she had received. The babies, meanwhile, continued to grow stronger, were putting on weight and becoming more alert. The village women had made them tiny clothes from soft deerskin, and they were warm and comfortable, in ways they had never been in that cold dirt house. But Margaret knew this couldn't last forever. Spring would come eventually, and she would have to make a choice about her future. She could try to return to the white settlements, but what kind of life would she have there? She was a widow with 2 small children and no money. The same people who had abandoned her once might do it again. Or she could stay here, in this place where people had shown her more kindness than her own neighbors ever had. But what would that mean for her babies? What kind of life would they have growing up between 2 worlds? These questions kept Margaret awake at night as she listened to the wind outside and felt her babies sleeping peacefully beside her. She was grateful to be alive, grateful that her children were healthy and safe. But she also knew that the hardest decisions were still ahead of her. Spring came slowly to the Kansas plains. The snow began to melt first around the village, creating small streams that bubbled down the hillsides. Margaret could hear the ice breaking up on the nearby river with loud cracks that echoed across the prairie. After months of winter silence, the sound of flowing water felt like music. She had been living with the Comanche for almost 3 months now. Her babies had grown strong and healthy, their cheeks round and pink. They smiled now when they saw familiar faces, and they had learned to recognize the voices of the women who cared for them. The village children called them the red-haired babies and often came to play with them, making funny faces to make them laugh. Margaret had learned much more of the Comanche language. She could have simple conversations now, ask for things she needed, and even tell stories about her life before. The women enjoyed hearing about her childhood in Missouri, about the farm where she grew up, and the way her family lived. In return, they taught her about their traditions, their beliefs, their way of seeing the world. But as the weather warmed, Margaret knew her time here was coming to an end. The village council had been patient with her, more generous than she ever expected, but she could feel the tension growing. Some of the warriors were getting restless, talking about white soldiers who had been asking questions in nearby towns. There were rumors that the army was looking for missing settlers, and everyone knew that having Margaret here could bring trouble. Ayanna felt the pressure too. He had spent many evenings sitting with Margaret by the fire, teaching her words and his language and learning more about hers. What had started as simple kindness had grown into something deeper, something that complicated everything. He found himself looking forward to their conversations each day. Margaret was different from what he had expected white women to be like. She was strong but gentle, grateful but not weak. She worked hard to learn their ways and never complained about the difficulties of adapting to a new life. She treated everyone with respect, from the oldest elder to the youngest child. Margaret felt the same confusion. Ayanna had saved her life, and the lives of her babies. But more than that, he had shown her a kindness and understanding that she had never found with her own people. When she talked to him, she felt heard and valued in ways that reminded her of the best parts of her. Marriage to Thomas. The situation became more complicated when scouts brought news that made everyone in the village nervous. A group of white settlers had been asking about missing people at the trading post 2 days' ride away. They mentioned a woman with red hair and twin babies who had disappeared during the winter storms. "They think you might be dead," Ayanna told Margaret that evening, "but they want to know for sure. And there are soldiers with them now asking the same questions." Margaret felt her heart sink. She had known this day would come, but she wasn't ready for it. "What does the council want me to do?" "They want you to decide quickly. Stay and risk bringing soldiers here, or go back to your people before anyone finds out where you've been." That night, Margaret lay awake listening to her babies breathing softly beside her. They were so different now from the tiny, weak infants Ayanna had carried through the blizzard. They were healthy and happy, surrounded by people who loved them. If she went back to the white settlements, what kind of life could she give them? She was still a widow with no money and no family nearby to help her. But if she stayed here, what would happen to them? Tensions between settlers and Native Americans were getting worse each year. There had been fights and raids on both sides. How could she raise her children in the middle of such conflict? And what about when they got older? Would they ever be accepted in either world? Ayanna was struggling with his own difficult thoughts. He had grown to care deeply for Margaret and her babies. The children felt like his own now. And Margaret had filled an emptiness in his life that he thought would never heal after losing his wife. But he also knew what his feelings could cost both of them. If Margaret stayed, and they became a family, his people would face questions from other tribes about why they were protecting white settlers. If soldiers came looking for her, it could lead to violence that would hurt innocent people. And if Margaret went back to the white towns, would she ever be accepted there after living with the Comanche? The decision became more urgent when a young warrior rode into camp with alarming news. "Soldiers are coming," he reported to the chief. 2 days behind me, maybe less. They have guides with them who know this area well." The village immediately began preparing for the possibility of conflict. Weapons were checked, horses were made ready. The women began packing things that could be moved quickly if they needed to leave. Everyone understood that having Margaret here when the soldiers arrived could turn a simple search into a battle. Margaret knew she had to make her choice now. That evening, she asked Ayanna to walk with her away from the village, where they could talk privately. They found a spot by the river where wildflowers were just beginning to bloom. The water rushed past them, carrying the last of the winter ice toward the distant ocean. "I have to go back," Margaret said quietly. "I can't let my presence here put your people in danger." Ayana had expected this, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "Where will you go? How will you live?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Maybe I can find work in one of the towns. Maybe someone will help me for the sake of the babies." They sat in silence for a while, both knowing that this might be their last conversation alone together. The feelings between them had grown strong over the winter months, but they also both understood how impossible their situation was. "There might be another way," Ayana said slowly, "but it would be dangerous for both of us." Margaret looked at him, hoping and fearing what he might say. "We could leave together, not go back to the white settlements, and not stay here where it brings trouble to my people. If we could find a place somewhere in between where we could make our own life." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying to Margaret. It would mean giving up any chance of returning to the life she had known before. It would mean raising her children in a world where they might never fully belong to either culture. But it would also mean staying with the man who had saved them, who had shown them more love and care than anyone else ever had. "Where would we go?" she asked. "There are places along the border where people trade with both sides," Ayana explained. "Fur traders, people who speak both languages and understand both ways of life. We could build a house there, maybe start a trading post of our own. It wouldn't be easy, but we would be together." Margaret thought about what this would mean for her babies. They would grow up knowing both worlds, speaking both languages. They would understand their mother's heritage and their adopted father's culture. Maybe that would make them stronger, better able to handle the complicated world they were being born into. But there were so many risks. What if other settlers refused to trade with them? What if Ayana's people saw him as a traitor for leaving? With a white woman? What if they couldn't make enough money to survive? What if the children were rejected by both communities as they grew up? "I need time to think," Margaret said finally. "We don't have much time," Ayana replied gently. "The soldiers will be here soon. Whatever we decide, it has to be tonight." As they walked back to the village, Margaret felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She looked at the lodges glowing with firelight, at the people who had saved her life and cared for her children. She thought about Ayana, who had risked everything to help strangers and had somehow become the most important person in her world. She also thought about the white settlements, about the life she had planned to build with Thomas, about the community she had been born into. That world had abandoned her when she needed help most. But it was still the only world she had ever really known. Tonight, she would have to choose between safety and love, between the familiar and the unknown, between staying true to where she came from and embracing where her heart was leading her. Whatever she decided would change not just her life, but the lives of her children and the man who had already given up so much to save them. The sound of the river followed them back to the village, its constant flow reminding Margaret that time, like water, only moved in one direction. By tomorrow, everything would be different, and there would be no going back. Margaret stood at the edge of the village as the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. She held both babies close to her chest, feeling their warm breath against her neck. This was the moment she had been dreading for weeks. The moment when she would have to leave the only place that had felt like home since Thomas died. She had made her decision in the dark hours before sunrise. After a sleepless night of weighing every possibility, the soldiers would arrive today, maybe in just a few hours. There was no more time to think or plan or hope for easier choices. Ayana approached her quietly, carrying a pack filled with supplies. His face was calm, but she could see the worry in his eyes. They had talked until nearly midnight, going over their plan again and again, making sure they understood all the risks they were taking. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Margaret nodded, though her heart was pounding. "I think so." "But Ayana, are you sure about this? You're giving up everything, your family, your home, your place in the tribe. What if we can't make this work?" He reached out and gently touched one of the babies' heads. "These children saved my life as much as I saved theirs. When I lost my wife and baby, I thought I would never have a family again. Now I have you and them. That's worth any risk." They had decided to leave together, but not to go back to the white settlements. Instead, they would travel to a remote area along the Arkansas River where traders and trappers from many backgrounds had built small communities. These were places where mixed families could live without as much judgment, where people cared more about survival and trade than about the color of someone's skin or the language they spoke at home. Winona came to say goodbye, bringing a special gift, a beautiful baby carrier made from soft deer hide and decorated with beads. "For carrying the little ones on your journey," she said, helping Margaret strap it on, "and to remember that you will always have family here." The old healer had tears in her eyes as she hugged Margaret. Over the winter months, she had grown to love this young white woman like a daughter. Margaret had worked hard to learn their ways, had shown respect for their traditions, and had never complained about the difficulties of adapting to a completely different life. "I'll never forget what you did for us," Margaret whispered. "You saved my babies' lives. You showed us that kindness has no color," Winona replied. "Your children will grow up to be bridges between our peoples. That is a great gift, Heather." Villagers came to say farewell. Some of the women brought small presents, warm clothes for the babies, dried food for the journey, medicine in case anyone got sick. Even some of the men who had been opposed to Margaret staying came to wish them well. They might not have agreed with the situation, but they respected Ayanna too much to let him leave with hard feelings. The village chief approached last. He was an old man who had seen many changes in his lifetime, who had learned that survival sometimes meant making difficult compromises. He placed his hand on Ayanna's shoulder and spoke in their native language. He says to remember that home is not a place, Ayanna translated for Margaret. "Home is the people you choose to love and protect," he says. "We carry the spirit of the tribe with us wherever we go." As they prepared to mount Ayanna's horse, they heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. The soldiers were closer than anyone had expected. There was no time for long goodbyes now. Margaret climbed up behind Ayanna, holding the babies securely in the carrier on her chest. She looked back at the village one last time, memorizing the faces of the people who had saved her life. The first part of their journey took them through rough country that Chana knew well. They followed animal trails and creek beds, staying away from the main paths where soldiers or other travelers might spot them. The babies traveled well, sleeping most of the time and nursing when they stopped to rest. On their second day of travel, they came across a group of soldiers camped by a stream. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when she saw the blue uniforms, but Ayanna calmly led them in a wide circle around the camp. The soldiers were busy with their own concerns and never noticed the small family passing through the hills above them. "They're still looking for you," Ayanna observed that evening as they made camp in a hidden valley. "But they're searching in the wrong direction. I think you might have tried to walk to town during the winter." Margaret shuddered to think. What would have happened if she had tried that desperate journey? She and the babies would have died in the snow long before reaching help. Instead, here they were, alive and healthy and together, starting a new life that none of them could have imagined just a few months ago. After a week of careful travel, they reached the trading settlement that Ayanna had told her about. It was smaller than Margaret had expected, just a dozen buildings scattered along the riverbank, with a few farms nearby. But as they rode into town, she could see that it was exactly what Ayanna had promised. There were white families living next to Mexican families next to Native American families. Children of all different backgrounds played together in the street. The store owner was a bearded man who greeted customers in 3 different languages. A woman hanging laundry had the dark skin of someone with African heritage, while her neighbor was clearly of European descent. "This is different," Margaret said, looking around with wonder. "Different good or different bad?" Ayanna asked with a small smile. "Different wonderful," she replied. They found lodging at a small inn run by a woman named Rosa, whose husband was a fur trader. Rosa took one look at Margaret and the babies and immediately began fussing over them, bringing warm food and clean blankets. She spoke Spanish and English, and a little bit of several native languages, and she didn't ask any awkward questions about how this mixed family had come to be. "You looking for a permanent place?" Rosa asked over dinner. "My husband. He knows about good land for sale. Cheap, because it's a little bit far from town, but good for people who want to start trading business." Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Ayanna explored their options. They found a piece of land about 5 miles from the settlement, with a small house that needed work and a barn that could be converted into a store. The previous owner had given up and moved back east, but the location was perfect for their plans. The land sat right on one of the main trading routes between the territories. Travelers from all backgrounds passed through regularly, needing supplies, food, and places to rest. There was also a good market for the kind of cultural exchange that Margaret and Ayanna could provide, translating languages, explaining customs, helping people from different backgrounds understand each other. They bought the property with money that Ayanna had saved from years of successful hunting and trading. Margaret contributed her knowledge of reading and writing, skills that were valuable in a trading business. Together, they began rebuilding not just the house and store, their entire lives. The babies thrived in their new environment. They were learning to crawl now, exploring every corner of their expanding world. Margaret spoke to them in English, while Ayanna spoke to them in Comanche, and they were already beginning to understand both languages. When other children came to visit, the babies seemed delighted by all the different faces and voices around them. As their first summer together passed, Margaret often thought about the choice she had made that terrifying night when the soldiers were approaching. She had given up any chance of returning to the life she had planned with Thomas, but she had gained something she never expected to find: a love that crossed all boundaries, and a family that celebrated differences instead of fearing them. Their trading post became successful quickly. People appreciated dealing with someone who understood their languages and customs. Margaret's ability to read and write helped with record-keeping and correspondence. Ayanna's knowledge of hunting and survival made him valuable to travelers heading into difficult territory, but most importantly, their children were growing up in a world where diversity was normal, where love mattered more than prejudice, where being different was seen as strength rather than weakness. Years later, when other mixed families faced discrimination elsewhere, they would find acceptance and support in the community that Margaret and Ayanna had helped to build. The babies, who had nearly died in a blizzard, grew up to become exactly what Winona had predicted: bridges between peoples, living proof that understanding and compassion could overcome fear and hatred. Their story became a quiet legend in the territory, passed down through generations as an example of how love could triumph over the prejudices that divided communities. Margaret never regretted her choice. On quiet evenings, when she watched her children playing while Ayanna worked on expanding their store, she remembered that cold night when she thought her story was ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of a life more beautiful than any she could have imagined.